Hello and welcome back to Communications 6019, and this is week 3. And in week 3, we're going to take a look at business communications in terms of indirect or bad news. That's the kind of thing you've got to think about and worry about when you're writing to individuals. Sometimes it's not always good news. Sometimes it's bad news or negative news. So that's what I want to talk about here in this first set of slides, talking about conveying negative news. There are ways to go about it properly. There is the direct and indirect strategies that we'll look at, how to set up an effective negative message with a buffer, an apology, or certainly reasons, showing a degree of empathy, then cushioning that bad news very quickly with alternatives and a pleasant closing. So that's essentially what we're going to be looking at. Techniques for refusing requests and claims, how you would write that back to someone, because you'll be running a company or a business or an organization where you are requested to do something and you can't. So again, you've got to convey bad news. How is that done properly? Okay, so as you can imagine, getting bad news is not a good thing. Bad news will disappoint people, irritate them. It will anger them, for example, because it's not the kind of news we want to get. But sometimes we have to convey negative news in some particular way. Now, there's a way around it in the sense that the receiver is going to feel less hurt or irritated or disappointed if you make it very clear the reasons for the rejection, the reasons for the bad news in the first place, or if they feel that the news has been revealed in a sensitive or empathetic nature. In other words, it cushions the blow when the reader or the receiver of this email or letter can see that you have taken the time to construct and compose a good letter. And a good letter is the kind of letter that we're going to talk about in this set of slides. So if you can show the reasons for the rejection, you can show sensitivity and empathy. And if the reader thinks that the matter has been treated seriously and fairly, chances are you're going to minimize that shock that accompanies other bad news letters or negative letters, because some people don't think them through. They simply just fire them off and go, well, too bad, but we shouldn't do that. Now, when we are composing these negative messages, we should think about some of the issues that are inherent in, well, sometimes trying to deal with a letter that we have received from someone who is irate, disappointed, whatever. We cannot turn around and use the same kind of abusive language. If not abusive, then careless language. I talked last week about how certain words have connotations that move you perhaps in the wrong direction in terms of conveying the proper message. So abusive and careless language is something you want to avoid at all costs. The other thing you want to do also is not kind of, digitally or in some way, put your arm around that person and say, hey, it's okay, it's okay. This is called the good guy syndrome, the nice person syndrome, we'll say. Personal feelings and opinions should not be placed into the body paragraphs of a business communication. It is, after all, a business. So present enough information to convey that sense of empathy and sympathy for the reader, but you don't need to put in your personal feelings. I'm really sorry personally that the following is, no. You have to figure out a way to set those personal feelings aside. You may be happy the person is getting bad news. Also, don't put that in. So regardless of what those personal feelings and opinions may be, do not put those into the email or the letter, because it is a business letter, not a personal letter. So what does that mean? What it means is you don't want to volunteer extra information. It's just not necessary. Okay. No matter what, unfavorable or negative or bad news doesn't always fall into the same sort of specific category. In other words, each time you have to convey bad news, you may not always have to or be able to present the same sort of template. So each time, as much as the news is good or bad, you want to be able to sort of look at it and assess each one very, very carefully. So the way in which you write a bad news letter that is specific to the context is to think exactly of that, the context, the audience, and the purpose for your message. And so when you sit down and formulate what the situation is, what the context is, at this point you have a choice. You can either write a direct or indirect email or letter. So let's look at the two styles, the two strategies that still have to do with bad news. Now, good news usually, almost always, will be done in a direct strategy. In other words, you're front-loaded and you tell people right away. But if it's bad news, you can still use the direct strategy under these conditions. If the bad news is minor or not damaging, if the receiver may overlook the bad news, there may be something in, for example, a three-paragraph email or letter where the bad news is somewhere kind of in the middle or at the end, and the person's reading through it, they're not sure what's going on. But if it's not really serious bad news, you can put it right at the very front and front load it so that the information is there right away. So the news is minor or not damaging. If you think the receiver may overlook it and miss it, if the organization itself, let's say the culture of that organization prefers directedness and straightforwardness. In other words, just the facts, right? Get to the point. Or if it is, for example, a final notice, right? A final warning for someone. If you need to be firm in that email or that letter, you want to make that right up front. This is your final warning towards the following. We're going to send this account to the collection agency or whatever it may be. Sometimes a direct strategy is helpful, useful, and in fact, very, very effective. So that was direct. Now, the trickier one is the indirect strategy. And again, we mentioned this or talked a little bit about it last week towards the very tail end, the last set of slides. So this should look kind of familiar, kind of going over the same terrain. Indirect strategy, very useful when the bad news is upsetting, or if you know that it's going to provoke some degree of hostility or disappointment or anger. If the news may threaten that customer relationship, the assignment you have for this week will deal exactly with number 3. So it's a relationship between a client and the person doing the work. And that relationship you wish to continue on good terms and with goodwill, but you've got to deal with some bad news. So if that's the case, indirect strategy is also very useful. Or if the news is unexpected, if that news is unexpected, let's say a layoff, a mass firing of some sort, well, you want to have as much buffer and as many reasons and empathetic statements before you drop that bad news. So if you use an indirect strategy, your motives are not to deceive the reader or hide the news or lie to them. Instead, you wish to present to the reader a degree of compassion, empathy, sympathy, and you can do that and still be an effective communicator. So an indirect approach, all right, there is a different relationship set up between the writer of the email or letter or the communication and the receiver. You still want to maintain that goodwill, but you also don't want to hurt that person's feelings or disappoint them to the degree where if it is a customer relationship, a business relationship, it could be threatened. You don't want to be doing that. Okay, so how would you go about writing an indirect strategy, negative, bad news email or letter, right? That's a mouthful. So you want to write it in an indirect way. And there is a strategy that can be used. And it's basically setting up, first of all, what's called a buffer. So you want to have a buffer. You then want to apologize if you need to, right? Apologize and show some degree of empathy. Then you want to present the reasons why the situation is considered negative or bad from the perspective of the reader. Then you cushion that bad news with alternatives. So you cushion the bad news beforehand with a buffer, an apology if necessary, a degree of empathy and reasons why. Then you present the bad news and very smoothly and quickly segue into alternatives, right? We cannot do this, but we can do that. And then you close pleasantly. So that's really essentially what a indirect strategy bad news letter would look like. So it varies in tone, it varies in structure, and it varies in information. And the really important thing is the overall tone of that letter. If you can maintain a tone of sympathy and empathy, an apology if necessary, and I'll get to that shortly, why that distinction needs to be made. And really, if you put yourself in the reader's place, put yourself in their shoes, in other words, you're being empathetic, you will probably do a better job of it. A degree of confidence in the reader that they will understand why things are the way they are. Maybe not the way they want, but it is at least good enough so that when you present that bad news, it makes sense. And it especially makes sense to them. That's really what you want to do. Now, you want to be courteous. You want to be polite. You want to not attack that person's integrity or pride. It sounds like a lot of work, but the more of these you do, because a direct strategy, good newsletter, anyone can write those. They're easy. The difficult ones are these, right? The negative news. So essentially, if you were to sort of draw it out in a kind of schematic sort of way, this is what it would look like. So on the left-hand side, right over here, you've got the buffer. So you either have the best news. Hey, we're doing the following. Hey, we are responding to a letter that you have sent to us regarding this following matter. You can start with a compliment or an appreciation of some sort. You can also agree with that person that there is a difficult situation that they're facing. So the buffer really can be any one of these things. It doesn't have to include every single one. Now, let's be clear on that. So it's best news or a compliment or an appreciation, agreement, fact, or an understanding and or an apology. So the buffer can be a combination of these things. So when you are writing your bad newsletter, your indirect strategy bad newsletter, don't look at this diagram and think, oh, I need to have every one of these. What it is 2 or 3 at the most, because that's what a buffer is. So secondly, the reasons can be, again, a combination of the following. A very careful and cautious explanation as to why you are leading towards bad news. Well, you could then present benefits if that is possibly the case, right? There could be benefits for the reader or others that are in a similar situation. Here you could explain company policy. Once a warranty expires, unless somebody wants to renew it with a payment, otherwise we just don't extend it for any reason. So that's a company policy explanation. You can talk about the situation using positive terms, as you should, no matter what. Evidence that was considered fairly and seriously. Again, this is where the empathy and the sympathy comes in. The last one here under reasons, evidence that matter was considered fairly and seriously. If the reader sees this, if the reader sees that the writer has considered their situation and their predicament and has, although presented bad news, they have put some thought into it. And that's part of the tone, right? You go back to the buffer and facts, understanding, and apology, followed by positive words and evidence as to why the matter was considered seriously. All those things lead up to softening the bad news. Now, the bad news itself, a third one here, which is usually paragraph 3, not paragraph 1. You can put what's called an embedded placement. You can put information in there that may sort of look towards one of the alternatives. So what you want to try to do in the bad news is be careful of the language, using the passive voice that takes the emphasis away from the subject of the sentence, but towards the object. Let's say, talk more about the warranty than the person that is now no longer going to have a warranty, which is, of course, the reader. So that would be a passive voice. There is an implied degree of refusal, an implied sort of saying no, but the word no should not appear in the email itself. And at this point, whether it's an embedded placement, a compromise, or an alternative, all those are leaning towards the second half of the paragraph that has the bad news, contains the bad news, but here you start presenting some alternatives. Now, the assignment will ask you to come up with 3 of them. And so that's important for 2 reasons. One, It shows that you put some thought into that letter and you understand that this person may not be happy with the present state of affairs, but you are presenting to them an alternative. In fact, 3 of them. And that allows you to segue into the last section, which is the closing, where you look forward to hearing from them. I've presented these 3 alternatives. Please, let's set up a meeting or a phone call or something, or a response that now re-engages the reader. So this person hasn't been kicked to the curb or left out in the rain somewhere. They're still brought back in and say, hey, we'd like to hear back from you. What do you think of these alternatives? Please let us know how you wish to proceed. So from there, you can move into a sense of good wishes and a sense of goodwill. You can include a freebie if you like, if that's at all possible. There's a possibility of a resale issue, but not all the time. In the assignment, for example, you still want to do the same procedure of the buffer, the reasons, the bad news. But in this one, where it's a business relationship, forward-looking information about alternatives, yes, good wishes for sure, but the last 3 won't matter as much. Freebies, resales, and sales promotion, those don't always matter. So don't try to kind of shoehorn a freebie into a situation between a client and a business. It's not going to work because it's not that kind of a client. So that's basically it. So let's kind of go through them a little bit more, starting with the buffer. Buffers should increase the effectiveness of a negative message because it does soften the bad news by pushing it back a little bit. So the buffer should be your first paragraph. And again, the same sort of thing as we saw on the previous slide. The best news, if you have one, always present that first, always. Follow with a compliment of one sort or another if you can, showing appreciation for their business, appreciation as a client, or whatever it may be. And start making statements upon which the writer and the reader can agree to. Because the more common ground you establish between these 2 parties, the less that bad news will be just that, bad news. Verifiable facts are important. We've had a really bad, the last 3 quarters of our business have been very, negative, or we've had a downturn in profits, or whatever it may be. Those verifiable facts then turn around and set up a kind of buffer to explain the next step, which is the reasons why the bad news is the way it is. No matter what, though, no matter what you're doing, you're still showing that you care about the reader. So what you're doing is you're presenting good news. You then show appreciation with a kind of compliment. You make statements. And again, these statements, the buffer only needs to be 3 or 4 sentences. But those few sentences really will matter if you can show these things, a compliment, an appreciation, making statements that both parties agree to, so that there is that common ground that you can build from as you move from that to the bad news, to the alternatives, and finally to the goodwill. So when you're cushioning that bad news, as you're working towards that 3rd paragraph, you can position the bad news sort of as a subordinate clause. In other words, due to the present situation as it presently stands, or something like that, comma, we are unable to, and then you carry on. So even in the sentence where the bad news is found, it's in the second half. It's in the subordinate clause. So not only can you put it in the second half of the sentence that's divided by a comma, you can also put it in the passive voice, where you de-emphasize the subject. And by doing that, you can kind of depersonalize the actions which are occurring that reflect directly upon the subject. But the passive voice moves the emphasis away from the subject, who may not have a warranty anymore, towards the warranty. So you are deflecting attention away from the subject, who is of course the reader of the letter, and towards the issue at hand, towards the object that you are discussing. And the object depersonalizes that action. Again, try to highlight the positives, right? Accentuate the positive by stressing what you can then turn around and do for the reader, and you're moving towards your alternatives. Imply the refusal. If you can not make it a direct statement, that's very helpful. But don't make it so diffused and depersonalized and vague that the reader isn't sure what you're saying. So that's kind of a balancing act. Implying the refusal, if you're a really good writer and are gifted in writing crafting a good sentence, you can probably do that. But for right now, be careful as to how much you're implying the refusal as opposed to stating it directly. If you absolutely cannot do that and imply the refusal, then try to use the least negative language that you can find. Cannot seems to be harsher than unable to at the present time, right? See how I'm implying the refusal, but it's not harsh, right? Unable to at the present time kind of leaves a door open later on to say perhaps in 6 months or 3 months or whatever. So be careful in how you imply the refusal. Don't make it so vague that it's not understandable, but also don't make it direct. So choose those words carefully. And then, of course, you're going to suggest a clear compromise. That's important. Okay, so the second part, this is kind of, again, going back to the overview. So now we're going to go back to the second paragraph, which is the apology leading to the reasons. Now, an apology is important if there is, in fact, an admission of guilt. If the company clearly has done something wrong, here's where you do the apology, right? You write it down. But you don't have to apologize if it's something that is beyond your control. If this is company policy, it's like nothing personal. I'm sorry, but this is the way we do business. Whether it's you or someone else, this is the way we conduct business. So be careful with that apology, that you don't admit guilt where it is unnecessary. Because here's what might happen. Your email could be used in court where somebody may sue your company and say, well, in this email, they said that I could have what I wanted. And, they said, oh, I'm sorry, we screwed up. So be careful. Be careful when you say that, because an apology works if it is not also an admission of guilt, unless it absolutely is. So be very clear when you use it. Be very certain that whatever the apology is, it isn't something that will land you in court. So be careful with that one. So the other thing that's also not easy is striking that right tone of sympathy and empathy. It is possible if you think of what's called the 5R model, right? Recognition, responsibility, remorse, restitution, and repeating, that it will not happen again. If you can do that, once again, you are indicating to the reader that you have thought this through. You are going to make sure that this issue that they're facing will not happen again to them. And there's the likelihood that it's a teachable moment, as they call it, right? It's a way for the company to learn, perhaps not to state things in such a way that people either misunderstand that perhaps a warranty will last longer than it actually does, or that a product will run longer than it should, whatever it may be. So the apologies, be careful with those. That admission of guilt, think about whether or not it could land you in court, and word it carefully. Empathy and sympathy are important. If you recognize the problem, take some degree of responsibility, show some degree of remorse. Again, this is if you're talking an apology. Okay, the reasons are very important as well, because this is now moving to the second half of the second body paragraph. So in the second half of it, you're trying to explain as clearly as you can what's going on. But again, you don't want to apologize to the degree that you now have created a kind of legal liability. Be careful with those. There are other benefits that can result from an initial error. This could segue nicely into one of your alternatives. It could happen there. The reasons could be explaining company policy. We don't typically do this that you're asking us to do because we just don't. Here's the reason why. So those are reasons that tell the receiver or the reader of the letter that they're not alone. This is the company policy, no matter who is asking about a particular situation. So again, it takes the onus away from you as the bad person, right? As the harbinger of bad news. No, this is company policy. We do this all the time. Even as you are doing this, always choose positive words. So anything that's demoralizing, depressing, negative, any of those connotations, rethink them. What is a better way for me to say something like that? Remember from a couple of weeks ago, previously owned car sounds better than used car, and they're essentially the same thing. So the words that you use should show fairness and an intent, right, to resolve that issue at hand. That's important. So again, a lot of it with the reasons, the main focus is keeping a positive tone, keeping a tone that is objective in the sense that that reader doesn't feel like they've been singled out and will be treated harshly, because no, this is company policy. So the alternatives, we talked about that previously in the 2 slides ago. Whatever that alternative may be, it's up to you. But once you present those alternatives, you want to close pleasantly. So you do that. Why? Because you still want to promote goodwill. And in the assignment that you need to do, that is very important, because you are essentially writing a bad news letter to a client who has hired you. So they're paying your wages and you have to kind of give them bad news. So absolutely, you still want to promote goodwill. You want to be able to look forward to future relations in business, definitely with that. You want to follow through or follow up on advice in terms of what the alternatives may have been. Please let us know what you wish to do. If it's a job rejection letter, for example, you can say, best of luck in your future endeavors. Not in this particular case in the assignment, but that's where you would put it otherwise. Again, freebies and resale and sales promotions, they don't have anything to do with your assignment for this week, but that's where you would put it if you wanted to close pleasantly, and that was an option, or that was an alternative that you could follow through with. Okay, there's a variety of different situations where you could write a bad news letter, and this is refusing requests and claims. Again, if you're not sure how the person is going to react, always err on the side of caution and write an indirect strategy letter. In other words, buffer, reasons, bad news, and a good close. Follow through with that structure and you'll be fine. So businesses, no matter who they are, will have disappointed customers or angry customers or confused customers, whatever it may be. And remember too that because of social media, if you basically dismiss these people and say, I don't want to hear from you, please stop bothering us or whatever, they can go to social media to let others know how poorly they were treated by your company. So be careful with that. Okay, so managing negative news online, you don't want to turn around and end up in a shouting match with people, because it kind of reduces both the original writer that went to social media and the company. It kind of may level the playing field, but you're at the bottom of the list, right? You don't want to be doing this. But be aware that people can air their gripes in public. And so the better you write a bad newsletter, the less likely they are to do that. And that's what's important. So social networks can be really good communication channels when it's good news, and make sure that when you are writing a bad newsletter that you keep that possibility in mind, right? And that's why it says you become proactive. Consider the fact that this person could go to, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or whatever that's out there, wherever they go, that they will turn around and hopefully say something good. And if they say something good about your company, then great. You've done an excellent job conveying bad news. But remember, you have to monitor those comments. Keep an eye on what people are saying, because it's there that things are really going to make a difference, because you have a lot less control with social media. And now you've got to go into damage control, right? You don't want to be doing that. The damage control starts before you even put pen to paper or open up your laptop to compose your bad news letter. So if you're doing that, you're less likely to get that bad news conveyed into social media. So direct strategy for sure with good news, direct strategy for bad news, depending on who it is. But if you don't know, err on the side of caution and compose it indirectly. Things like rate increases and price hikes, they're fairly straightforward, so you want to let people know right away. So a direct strategy is good. Well, denying claims or refusing credit, this is something that is bad news, but there is a chance that you may want to have these people come back. Let's say refusing credit, there's a chance that this person could improve their credit. let's say they're going for a mortgage and they have an account with your bank. Let's say you work for TD Bank and your client has an account with your bank and has some investments through your bank, but you've turned them down for a mortgage for whatever reason. Let's say their debt service ratio is too high, okay, as an example. So you're refusing credit or you're turning down a mortgage, but you also don't want to have them turn around and say, well, I'll show you. And they take all their investments out, they take their money out, they just say, see ya, I'm done, screw you guys. So you've got to be careful. There will be different situations that call for different kinds of tones and empathy. Avoid language that's going to rile these people up. Try to retain the customer, now on a cash basis for a mortgage. No, it's not going to happen. But we're talking specifically here about refusing credit. There are different ways in which you can address that and still let that person know that at the present time, we cannot, give you a mortgage. But if you would like to come in, and speak to us, let's see what we can do to facilitate the possibility of getting it the next time. Goodwill, positive, alternatives, and the person will say, oh, okay. And that's when you bring them in and say, okay, well, let's see what you have financially speaking that would allow us to give you a mortgage, let's say in 6 months. Then off you go. So refusing credit, careful with the language. That may cause hard feelings, and especially number 4, avoid disclosure that could cause a lawsuit. If you turn around and you're reading a letter and it's discriminatory, and there it is in black and white, you can take someone to court over that, right? You can sue that person. So you need to be really careful. Okay, now bad news within an organization also needs to be delivered in some way, and you can do that in person, but you still have to prepare for it. You have to decide whether that negative information is worthy of news. Is this something that people need to know? Now, once that news has been identified, will it upset the person that's hearing it? So again, go for the reasons first strategy, which is the indirect one. Get all that relevant information. Prepare what you're going to say, because in this case, I would highly recommend not walking in blind and unprepared. Prepare and rehearse what you're going to say. Think about that person that's going to hear that information. So get that information, prepare and rehearse the order in which you're going to present it, explain in detail. If you wish to take someone in with you, depending if it's a union shop, you may wish for a union rep to be there, because a union rep will act as a kind of buffer, because union reps kind of work with companies to deal with employees that have union issues or company issues. So they themselves act as a kind of buffer. Think too about the timing. If you find out about this information like 1 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, do you want to really go after someone, on a Friday at 4, rather than just waiting and taking the time to prepare over the weekend to meet that person on Monday morning? That's probably a lot more effective. People are going to be, rested. They've had a weekend off. They're going to be a little bit more alert. So be careful with that. So timing is everything. And also too, let the person take their time, responding, and let that person digest and, think about the information they've been given. Give them time to recover, right? And to respond. That's important. Now, within the company as well, within the organization, managers may refuse requests from employees. And again, you want to focus on the explanations rather than the refusal and apologies. So again, using the passive voice, you de-emphasize the subject, in other words, the reader of the letter, and emphasize instead the object that both of you are discussing, which is, some request to do something to, increase one's wage, or taking time off, or whatever it may be. Bad news to employees and to the public, again, the same thing. I would say if it's bad news, absolutely a buffer, apology and or reasons before you get to the bad news. And then if you can make alternatives, absolutely. But if it's really bad news, like let's say this plant is going to close in a year, you want to give people reasons. But here there are kind of no alternatives. This plant will close in a year. That's the end of it. So think about the situation before you sit down and compose that letter email, because all of these things do matter. Sometimes a job application, you may end up working in some capacity in HR or whatever, or you may run your own company and you are looking at job applications. You have to say no, right? There's only one person for the job. So if you're being refused a job, that's difficult. And you want to be able to, at the very least, know why. So if that's the case, it would be nice that the HR department, if they're the ones doing it, give you some reasons, right? Some reasons as to why you weren't hired. It could be your experience, your background, your accreditation, your degrees and diplomas, whatever. Because again, here, the apology needs to be thought through carefully, because if it comes out that it explicitly is either sexist or racist or bigoted or discriminatory in some way, that's a legal issue, right? That's against the law. It's against the Charter of Rights in Canada. So wrongful dismissal, wrongful action, discrimination, those things, be very careful with it. So if you're saying no to a job applicant, it better be specifically tied to their skills, their skill set, soft skills, degrees and whatever, than it is about themselves. And once again, take the time to pre-write it, to draft it and revise it if necessary, so that when you send it to that person, it will make sense to them. And they're not going to turn around and say, well, the hell with that, and pick up a phone and call a lawyer. That's not what you want. You want them to look at it and go, okay, you know what? I need to work on this. This company has identified clearly a weakness in my employment package, we'll say. So I need to work on this. Communication skills, or I may be missing a degree or diploma, and they've identified it. So now you go, okay, that was useful, rather than focusing on like, oh man, they said no, right? They turned me down. They turned you down, but they explained clearly why. And it wasn't a personal attack or a value judgment on you as a person, but on something that was missing in your skill set. Those are the best letters to get. Okay, so what have we looked at? We talked about business communication conveying negative news. We talked about direct and indirect strategies in conveying unfavorable news. Now remember, you can still write a negative news email or letter in a direct strategy if you know that's what the reader wishes, because that's the way they conduct business, or the news is minor. If it's major, always in direct strategy. What makes an effective negative message? The opener, the buffer, the apologies, the empathy, the reasons, cushioning the bad news with alternatives, and then a pleasant closing. Effective techniques for refusing typical requests as claims, saying no to a job applicant, denying a claim, denying a warranty, whatever. It may depend. Now, having said all of this, your assignment doesn't have anything to do with those. It's kind of a unique situation, but a difficult one. And then finally, effective techniques for delivering bad news within an organization. So remember timing. Remember whether or not you need to do it, in a letter format or in person. Those things you need to weigh. So that's the end of this first set of slides, and I shall be back shortly with another one.